Daniel Foster had what appeared to be the perfect life, a successful career, a beautiful wife named Sarah, and a home in the suburbs that was the envy of his peers. As a senior manager at Crestview Industries, he was on the fast track to a top executive position. His boss, Richard Walker, had taken a particular liking to him, often inviting him to exclusive events and entrusting him with major projects. At home, things seemed just as perfect. Sarah, a talented interior designer, had an eye for elegance and a heart full of love. At least that's what Daniel believed. They had been married for 5 years, and despite the usual ups and downs, Daniel thought they were happy. But beneath the surface, something sinister was brewing. In recent months, Daniel noticed a change in Sarah. She seemed distant, often lost in thought, and her once warm affection had cooled. At first, he dismissed it as stress from work, or the usual ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But as the days passed, his unease grew. Sarah had started spending more time working late and was often on her phone, texting with a nervous energy she tried to hide. At the same time, Richard had become unusually interested in Daniel's personal life, frequently asking about Sarah and their relationship. It struck Daniel as odd, but he didn't dwell on it. He trusted Sarah implicitly, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they began to fester in Daniel's mind. Daniel Foster had always prided himself on his intuition, his ability to read people and situations, a skill that had served him well in both his personal and professional life. Yet as he drove home that fateful evening, he was oblivious to the storm brewing on his own doorstep. The day had been long and stressful, filled with endless meetings and tight deadlines. But as he pulled into the driveway of his suburban home, all he could think about was the surprise he had planned for Sarah. His wife of 5 years, Daniel had left work early, something he rarely did, with the intention of surprising Sarah with a romantic evening. He had picked up her favorite takeout from the Italian restaurant they used to frequent when they were dating, and had even bought a bouquet of lilies, her favorite flowers. As he parked the car, he noticed something that struck him as odd. Richard Walker's car, his boss's sleek black luxury sedan, was parked a few houses down the street. A wave of unease washed over Daniel, though he couldn't quite place why. Richard lived in a different part of town, far from the quiet tree-lined streets of Daniel's neighborhood. The fact that Richard's car was parked here at this time felt out of place. But Daniel quickly brushed off the thought, convincing himself that it was just a coincidence. After all, Richard was a prominent man with many connections. Perhaps he was visiting someone nearby. Daniel took a deep breath, grabbed the food and flowers, and headed inside, determined to push the uneasy feeling aside. The house was eerily quiet as Daniel stepped inside. Usually he was greeted by the sound of Sarah bustling around, maybe cooking or watching television, but today there was nothing, just silence. Daniel called out to her, but there was no response. His unease grew as he walked through the hallway. His footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Something was off. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. As he made his way upstairs, he noticed that the door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. Daniel hesitated, his heart beginning to race. The uneasy feeling he had tried to dismiss now gnawed at him with increasing intensity. He approached the door quietly, almost instinctively on his toes, as if some part of him already knew what he was about to find. Peering through the crack in the door, Daniel's worst fears were realized. There, on the bed they had shared for years, were Sarah and Richard, locked in a passionate embrace. Sarah's laughter, which he had always found so beautiful, now cut through him like a knife as she murmured something into Richard's ear, her voice filled with a softness that had been missing in their own conversations for months. For a moment, Daniel was paralyzed, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. His wife, the woman he loved, was betraying him with his boss, the man who had been mentoring him, guiding him toward what he thought was a promising future. It was as if the ground beneath him had given way, and he was plummeting into an abyss from which there was no escape. Time seemed to stand still. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. His hands, still clutching the takeout and flowers, began to tremble. The food slipped from his grasp, the bag hitting the floor with a soft thud. The noise, though barely audible, snapped him back to reality. In that instant, a mix of emotions surged through Daniel. Rage, betrayal, heartbreak and disbelief, all mingling into a toxic brew. He felt a primal urge to burst into the room, to confront them, to demand answers. But something held him back. A part of him, the rational, calculating part, knew that confronting them in that moment would only lead to chaos. And so, with a Herculean effort, he forced himself to remain still, his breathing shallow and rapid as he fought to keep from crying out. He took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest, and quickly but quietly retreated down the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity, his legs weak and unsteady. When he reached the front door, he glanced back up the staircase one last time, as if hoping that what he had seen was some sort of sick hallucination. But deep down, he knew the truth. The life he thought he knew was over, shattered in an instant. Outside, the cool evening air hit Daniel like a splash of cold water, shocking him back to his senses. He dropped the bouquet of lilies on the porch, the delicate petals scattering across the ground as he stumbled toward his car. He needed to get away, to think, to process what had just happened. His hands were shaking so badly that he fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before finally managing to unlock the door. He slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a long moment, Daniel just sat there, his mind racing. The anger he had initially felt was now giving way to something darker, more calculating. He had always prided himself on being a man of reason, someone who thought things through before acting, and as the initial shock of the betrayal began to subside, he realized that he couldn't just act on impulse. No, if he was going to do this, he needed to be smart about it. He needed to make them both pay and pay dearly. With a cold determination settling over him, Daniel started the car and drove away, his mind already formulating a plan. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He would bide his time, gather the evidence, and when the moment was right, he would strike. And when he did, he would make sure that Sarah and Richard felt every bit of the pain they had inflicted on him. As he drove through the darkened streets, the image of Sarah and Richard together burned in his mind, fueling the fire that now raged within him. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances. He would see to it that their betrayal would not go unpunished. The perfect life he thought he had was gone, replaced by a new reality, one in which he would be the judge, jury, and executioner. And so, with his heart hardened and his resolve steeled, Daniel began the first steps down a path from which there would be no return. The man he had been, loving husband, loyal employee, was dead. In his place was someone else entirely. Someone who would stop at nothing to exact the revenge he so desperately craved. As he drove into the night, Daniel couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. They had no idea what was coming, no idea of the storm that was about to descend upon them. And when it did, it would destroy everything in its path. Daniel spent the next few days in a daze, his thoughts consumed by the betrayal and the need for revenge. But he knew that acting on impulse would be foolish. If he wanted to make Sarah and Richard suffer as much as he was, he needed to be smart, methodical. He began to form a plan, one that would not only ruin their lives, but also make sure they felt the pain of their betrayal long after it was over. First, he started gathering evidence. He installed a hidden camera in the bedroom to capture Sarah and Richard's next encounter. He also began documenting Richard's business dealings, knowing that Crestview Industries had a zero-tolerance policy for unethical behavior. Daniel was privy to several questionable deals Richard had made, and he started collecting evidence that could destroy Richard's career. At the same time, Daniel played the role of the unsuspecting husband, acting as if nothing had changed. He continued to go to work, even interacting with Richard as though nothing were amiss. But beneath the surface, his mind was calculating every move, every step of his plan. He knew it was only a matter of time before he struck. Daniel's patience paid off when he finally captured footage of Sarah and Richard together. The images were clear, damning, and left no room for doubt. With this evidence in hand, Daniel moved to the next phase of his plan. He anonymously sent the footage to the Crestview Board of Directors, along with the documentation of Richard's unethical business practices. The impact was immediate. Richard was called in for a meeting with the board, and within hours he was suspended pending a full investigation. The news spread quickly through the company, and Daniel watched with grim satisfaction as Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Richard, unaware of Daniel's involvement, was blindsided by the sudden turn of events. He tried to contact Sarah for comfort, but she was equally shaken. She had no idea how their affair had been exposed, and the fear of losing everything gripped her. But the worst was yet to come as Richard's career collapsed. Daniel decided it was time to confront Sarah. He arranged a dinner at a quiet, upscale restaurant, pretending that he wanted to rekindle their relationship after noticing the distance between them. Sarah, desperate to cling to any semblance of normalcy, agreed. During the dinner, Daniel subtly let Sarah know that he was aware of her affair. He didn't show his anger or accuse her directly. Instead, he calmly hinted that he knew more than she realized. Sarah paled, her guilt written all over her face. She stumbled over her words, trying to deny it, but Daniel's cold gaze told her that the game was up. But what Sarah didn't know was that Daniel had tampered with her drink, adding a mild sedative that would make her more pliable and less coherent. As the evening wore on, Sarah became drowsy and disoriented, barely able to keep her eyes open. Daniel drove her home, and by the time they arrived, she was almost unconscious. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, barely awake, Daniel took the opportunity to search her phone. What he found only fueled his rage: explicit messages and photos between Sarah and Richard, confirming the extent of their betrayal. Daniel deleted the incriminating files from her phone, but saved copies for himself. His plan was moving forward perfectly, or so he thought. The next day, Richard, now jobless and desperate, showed up at the Foster household. Demanding to speak with Sarah, Daniel had anticipated this and was ready. As Richard ranted about the injustice of his situation and begged Sarah to run away with him, Daniel quietly listened from the other room. When Richard's pleas turned to threats, Daniel decided it was time to step in. He entered the living room, his face a mask of calm, and offered Richard a drink. Richard, too agitated to notice the tension in the air, accepted as the two men sat across from each other. Daniel began to subtly bait Richard, questioning his loyalty, his morals, and his judgment. The conversation quickly escalated, with Richard growing increasingly defensive and hostile. Just as Richard was about to leave in a rage, Daniel dropped the final bombshell. He revealed that it was he who had exposed Richard's affair to the board, effectively ruining his career. Richard was stunned, his anger turning to disbelief as he realized he had been played, but before he could react, Daniel struck, this time not with words, but with violence. In a moment of blind fury, Daniel attacked Richard, the fight quickly turning brutal. Years of pent-up rage fueled Daniel's blows, and Richard, though physically strong, was caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack. The struggle ended with a loud crash as Richard's head struck the edge of the coffee table, leaving him unconscious and bleeding on the floor. Sarah, who had been too shocked to intervene, screamed and rushed to Richard's side. But it was too late. The impact had been fatal, and Richard lay dead at her feet. Daniel stood over them, breathing heavily, the reality of what he had just done slowly sinking in. Panic set in as Daniel realized the gravity of his actions. He had planned for revenge, but he hadn't intended for it to end in murder, at least not this soon. But there was no going back now. He had to think fast. He quickly devised a plan to make Richard's death look like an accident. He cleaned up the scene as best he could, erasing any signs of a struggle, and staged the living room to look as though Richard had tripped and fallen while alone in the house. Sarah, still in shock, was in no condition to argue. She numbly followed Daniel's instructions, too terrified to think for herself. Daniel then called 911. Feigning distress as he reported that he had come home to find Richard dead in his living room, the police arrived quickly and Daniel put on the performance of a lifetime, playing the role of the devastated husband who had just lost his wife's lover in a tragic accident. The police, finding no immediate signs of foul play, initially bought Daniel's story. They noted the tension between Daniel and Sarah, but chalked it up to the stress of the situation. Richard's body was taken away, and the police began their investigation. But Daniel felt confident that he had covered his tracks well enough to avoid suspicion. But as days turned into weeks, Daniel's carefully constructed world began to unravel. The police investigation, though initially routine, started to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding Richard's death. A few inconsistencies in Daniel's story, coupled with his suspicious behavior in the days following the incident, raised red flags. Sarah, consumed by guilt and fear, began to crack under the pressure. She became withdrawn, barely speaking to Daniel and avoiding the police as much as possible. Her mental state deteriorated rapidly, and Daniel's attempts to control the situation only made things worse. One night, after a particularly intense argument with Daniel, Sarah disappeared. Daniel searched frantically for her, but she was nowhere to be found. Hours later, he received a call from the police. They had found Sarah wandering the streets, disoriented and talking about the blood and the man who died. She was taken to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation, and Daniel's world came crashing down. The police, now fully aware that something was amiss, reopened their investigation into Richard's death. They began to scrutinize Daniel's every move, questioning his colleagues, neighbors, and anyone who might have insight into his relationship with Sarah and Richard. It wasn't long before they uncovered the hidden camera footage Daniel had forgotten to erase, showing Sarah and Richard together in the house. The discovery of the footage was the final nail in the coffin for Daniel. The police now had enough evidence to piece together what had really happened. They confronted Daniel with the footage, and he knew that his time was up. The once confident, calculating man was now a shell of his former self, cornered and desperate. In a last-ditch effort to avoid arrest, Daniel tried to flee the country. But the police were one step ahead, and he was apprehended at the airport, handcuffed in front of dozens of onlookers. The media quickly picked up the story, and soon the entire town knew the sordid details of Daniel's revenge plot gone wrong. As he was led away, Daniel couldn't help but think about how everything had spiraled out of control. What had started as a plan to make his wife and boss pay for their betrayal had ended in murder, madness, and his own downfall. Daniel's trial became a media sensation, with reporters flocking to cover the story of the man who had taken revenge on his cheating wife and her lover. The prosecution painted Daniel as a cold, calculating murderer who had meticulously planned and executed his revenge. They presented the hidden camera footage, the tampered evidence, and Sarah's testimony as proof of his guilt. Sarah, though deeply traumatized, testified against Daniel. She recounted the events leading up to Richard's death, her voice trembling as she described the moment Daniel had attacked Richard in a fit of rage. The jury was captivated by her story, and the prosecution used her testimony to drive home the image of Daniel as a man who had lost control and committed a heinous act. Daniel's defense tried to argue that Richard's death was an accident, that Daniel had been provoked by the affair and acted in a moment of temporary insanity. But the evidence was too damning, and the jury saw through the defense's arguments. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a verdict guilty of second-degree murder. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The years that followed Daniel Foster's conviction were marked by a slow, agonizing descent into a life he could never have imagined. Once a man of power, control, and ambition, he now found himself a number, a face among the many in the cold, unyielding world of prison life. The walls of the penitentiary became his new home, the clanging of metal bars, his constant companion, and the suffocating air of regret and lost opportunities. His only solace. Daniel's cell was small and sparse, with nothing to personalize the space except for a few dog-eared books and a small, worn-out photograph of a life he once had. Every day was the same. Wake up, eat, work, return to his cell and sleep. The monotony was relentless, with each day bleeding into the next, devoid of purpose or meaning. Time lost its meaning, days blending into weeks, weeks into months and months into years. But it was not just the physical confinement that tormented Daniel. The real prison was in his mind, where the memories of his past played on an endless loop. The day he discovered Sarah and Richard, the rage that had consumed him the night of the murder. These moments replayed over and over, each time with the same sickening clarity. He would lie awake at night, staring at the cracked ceiling of his cell, haunted by the what-ifs and the might-have-beens. What if he had confronted Sarah calmly? What if he had walked away, left the town, started anew? What if he had simply let it go? But those what-ifs offered no escape from the reality he had created. He had let anger and betrayal consume him. And in doing so, he had destroyed everything. Sarah, the woman he had once loved more than anything, was gone, vanished into a life far removed from his own. He often wondered where she was, what she was doing, and whether she ever thought of him. The media had reported that she had been given a new identity as part of a witness protection program, but Daniel had no way of knowing if that was true. He could only imagine her living somewhere far away. Trying to piece together the fragments of a life shattered by his actions, Sarah's own life had become a quiet, shadowed existence. The weight of her guilt had never truly left her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's lifeless body, the blood on the floor, and Daniel's cold, expressionless face as he had stood over the corpse. She tried to move on to build something resembling a normal life, but the past was always there, lurking in the corners of her mind. Ready to pounce at the slightest provocation, Sarah had moved to a small town far from Crestview, where no one knew her story, where she could be just another face in the crowd. She had taken on a new name, a new job, and tried to disappear into the mundane rhythm of everyday life. But the nightmares followed her, as did the whispers of what had happened. She could never fully escape the shadow of that night, and every new relationship, every attempt to start over, was tainted by the guilt that clung to her like a shroud. Richard Walker's death had cast a long shadow over Crestview Industries. The scandal had rocked the company to its core, and while it eventually moved on, the memory of what had happened remained like a dark stain. Employees whispered about it in the hallways. Board members made veiled references during meetings, and new hires were briefed on the tragedy as part of the company's lore. Crestview had survived, but it had been changed, scarred by the events that had unfolded within its ranks. As for Daniel, his life behind bars was a daily exercise in survival. Prison was a brutal, unforgiving place where weakness was preyed upon and violence was never far away. Daniel, once a man of status and authority, quickly learned that his former life meant nothing in this new world. He kept to himself, avoiding the gangs and the politics of prison life as much as possible. He had no interest in making friends or forming alliances. His sole focus was on enduring each day, one at a time. But even in prison, the past was never far behind. Other inmates, hearing of his story, would taunt him, reminding him of what he had done, of what he had lost. The guards, too, would occasionally make snide remarks. A cruel joke here, a biting comment there. Daniel took it all in silence, the words cutting deep, but leaving no visible scars. He had come to accept that this was his life now. A life defined by his past mistakes with no hope of redemption. Yet despite the bleakness of his existence, Daniel found himself clinging to one thing, the memory of his son, Michael. Michael had been a child when all of this had happened, too young to fully understand the complexities of what had gone on, but old enough to be scarred by it. Daniel often wondered what had become of him, whether he had managed to escape the legacy of his father's actions, or whether he, too, had been consumed by the darkness. The prison system had allowed Daniel to receive letters from Michael during his early years of incarceration, but over time the letters had become less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. Daniel feared that Michael had decided to sever all ties, to forget the man who had once been his father. It was a fear that gnawed at him daily, a slow, corrosive dread that ate away at the last remnants of his soul. But in those quiet moments, late at night, when the prison was still and the only sound was the distant hum of the fluorescent lights, Daniel would close his eyes and imagine Michael living a better life, a life free from the shadows of his father's sins. It was a small comfort, a fragile hope that perhaps in some small way Michael had managed to find peace, even if Daniel never would. As the years dragged on, Daniel's health began to deteriorate. The stress, the guilt, and the harsh conditions of prison life took their toll. He aged rapidly, his one strong body now frail, his hair gray and thinning. The doctors diagnosed him with a heart condition, a direct result of the stress and isolation he had endured. They told him he didn't have much time left, perhaps a year, maybe less. When Daniel received the news, he felt strangely numb. There was no panic, no fear, only a weary acceptance. He had already lost everything that mattered. Death was merely the final step in a journey that had ended long ago. He spent his remaining days in a kind of reflective solitude, his thoughts turning more and more to the past, to the choices that had led him to this point. In his final moments, Daniel was alone in his cell, the cold light of dawn filtering through the barred window. As he lay on the hard cot, his breathing shallow and labored, he thought of Sarah, of Michael, of Richard, and of the man he used to be. He wondered if there was anything after this, if there was a chance for redemption beyond the grave. But as the darkness closed in, those thoughts drifted away, replaced by a profound, all-encompassing sense of regret. And so, with no one to mourn him, Daniel Foster slipped away, his life ending not with a bang, but with a quiet, lonely whisper. The world moved on, as it always does, leaving his story behind as just another cautionary tale, an example of how love, betrayal, and vengeance can destroy even the best of men. For Sarah, There would be no closure, no final goodbye. The news of Daniel's death reached her months later, and when it did, she felt only a hollow emptiness. She had already mourned him in her own way years before. The man she had loved had died the night Richard had, leaving behind only a ghost of what once was. Sarah continued her life, but the weight of the past was always there, a burden she would carry until her own end. In the end, Daniel's quest for revenge had led only to destruction, destroying not just those he sought to punish, but himself as well. The perfect life he had once imagined was gone, replaced by a legacy of bitterness, regret, and endless sorrow. And as the years went on, the memory of Daniel Foster faded, leaving behind only the echoes of a life that had gone terribly, tragically wrong.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.